This is the last story that Jesus tells. In the Gospel of Matthew, this is the last lesson that Jesus teaches his disciples. And we love the part about the sheep. Those who do compassion inherit the kingdom. We don't read the part about the goats, those who are damned to eternal hell for not doing compassion. To quote Matthew, the damned are damned to the eternal fires prepared for the devil and his angels. Wow. Matthew can be a fire and brimstone preacher. This doesn't sound like Jesus. Still, Matthew tells this story to impress upon us how essential to our faith it is that we show compassion to the least powerful and the most vulnerable of God's children. It is essential. In 2011, I stood before a beautiful girl with dark brown skin, wearing a navy blue cardigan over a neat pink blouse. She's standing in a simple classroom with cement walls and a few fluorescent lights hanging from the bare wooden beams overhead, and she's smiling. A few years ago, she would not have been able to attend the Shikoho Secondary School because girls didn't get to go to school. Girls had to walk to the springs, one of the local springs, to get the water. Now, a spring basically consisted of a pipe of water coming out of the ground. And most of them were in a mud pit. And it happened that way because when people came to get the water, so many people came that to get the water, to get down, you had to slide down the red clay mud pit to get the water. And this is what girls did. But then, Chevy Chase Presbyterian Church partnered with an NGO called Energy Without Borders, and in 2005, they were able to bring the electricity from a neighboring village. And from there, they were able to bring electricity to the schools and eventually to all the homes. And once you have electricity, you can drill a borehole and have a water pump. And when we were there in 2011, we dedicated the water pump that brought the water so the girls didn't have to go walk and get the water from the spring. Now, Dr. Jim Shellhammer was there, and Dr. Jim was so moved by the water. It wasn't just the water itself, but it was because there were a line of little children wearing Crocs, all lined up to wash their hands before they got to eat. See, we support an orphan feeding program where 160 children who would be at risk for hunger because one of their parents has died of AIDS or maybe now of COVID, but they get to eat a meal. Every day they go to school and they get to take some home. That's why this young woman is smiling. She gets to go to school. She gets to eat. And the orphan feeding program is even more important this year because they've had a bad crop. Early rains came and late rains, and the seeds' growth was stunted. And then there was travel issues with COVID. Couldn't travel to get the seeds and the fertilizer. So this year there will be more children who need our justice, mercy, and love. Chevy Chase Presbyterian Church has had hands-on in Shikoho, Kenya for more than 30 years. You've given Crocs. You have placed your money for the hunger offering in the basket. We have been hands-on for more than 30 years. I was talking with Rebecca Kallenberg. She's the social worker for our transition assistance program, and we came up with a number for what it takes to get somebody back on their feet. $43. Over this past few months, since they were able to open in January on the phone with people and online, she said, this is a pretty typical story. A man has a job and a restaurant and a good apartment. And then COVID. And the restaurant closes. And there's no job. There's no getting another job. Pretty soon, there's no apartment. So this man rented a storage locker for his stuff so that he could continue to try to look for a job. He has no place to live. All of his stuff is in a storage locker, and then he misses the payment on the storage locker. All of his stuff is thrown away. That's the day he called TAP. He doesn't know where his ID is. His birth certificate was lost or thrown away. And to get a new ID, or to get the birth certificate, he has to go online and pay for it with a credit card. He doesn't have internet access, let alone a credit card. The TAP volunteers, they're 2 days a week now. Help him by listening and going online for him and paying the $23 to get the birth certificate. And once he has the birth certificate, they help him pay the $20 to get the ID. And the first thing that happens when he gets the ID is he applies for Medicaid because he hasn't had any health insurance or health care. And the second thing he does is apply for food stamps, so he has something to eat. And the next thing he does is our TAP people send him over to Friendship Place, which will help him get housing. Of course, Friendship Place was started by members of Chevy Chase, and until just a few years ago, the executive director was a member of Chevy Chase. And after he'd gone and gotten some help with housing, we'll send him to Jubilee Jobs that will get him set for an interview to get a new job. Jubilee Jobs, executive director, founder, member of Chevy Chase Presbyterian Church. You can volunteer for TAP one morning a month, and you will see Jesus. In 1975, a mother with 7 daughters were living in a refugee camp in Malaysia. They'd fled Vietnam. Now, Mr. Tran and his mother had already made it to the United States. So Chevy Chase Presbyterian Church, way back then, formed the Vietnam Task Force. And members of the church were able to get that family to the U.S. and reunite them. CCPC rented a home and furnished it. Out of death came life. Once you start doing something, it just becomes easier, or maybe it just becomes too hard not to keep doing it. After Saigon fell, U.S. forces were able to evacuate many of the Vietnamese civilians who had worked for the U.S. military, but not everyone. As you heard Luan Fan Win say her father was a translator for the U.S. military, but he didn't get out. Their family didn't get out. And in their last chance at life, they fled Vietnam in a boat. They survived and lived for 8 months in refugee camps in Hong Kong and Nha Trang. And Presbyterian Church here, we formed the first Refugee Resettlement Committee. And you remember Luan talking about how Lucy Kecker and members of this church rented a house and furnished it, and how Lucy was there the day when Luan and the whole Fan family came home to that warm, furnished, loving house. Jesus brings people from death to life, and we get to help. It's what the church is for. In 2015, Merritt will tell us more about this, but I remember most Rude's eyes. These bright, shining eyes, but also so shy. All she wanted to do was go color with her little brother Adnan in the corner. But first she had to say hello to everybody in Chadsey Hall, in Geneva Hall. I think she was wearing a red taffeta dress that had sparkles. She was 6, but when she was 3 or 4 years old, the family's apartment in Homs, Syria was bombed while they were in it. And that's when they fled to the refugee camp. She was 3 or 4 when that happened, and 6 when the family arrived. Folks from our church negotiated, got an apartment over in my neighborhood, on the edge of Chevy Chase, just before you get to Silver Spring, where there are many immigrants who live. You furnished that apartment. You found a pediatric dentist to take care of Ruth's and Adnan's teeth that were riddled with cavities. Rude enrolled in Rock Creek Forest Chevy Elementary School, where my girls went to school. My girls, Emma, was a reading buddy for 2 Syrian twins. She helped them learn English. One day when I was helping to pick up Rude, those girls Emma had helped to teach read were teaching Rude. Adnan attended the weekday nursery school. Isan has a landscaping job. Amar went to Montgomery County College. She earned a certificate and works in a doctor's office. They have a home in Glen Burnie. Rude is in middle school on the honor roll. But this is not the most important thing that Merritt and Luan and members of the church did, because it became known what this church did. One of the first, Governor Hogan, said, "We will not have Syrian refugees in Maryland, but you know what? Because of Merritt's leadership and the session and this church, we had Syrian refugees in Maryland." And this church then taught and build a network to teach other churches. And PDA, Presbyterian Disaster Assistance, made a documentary, Free to Breathe, which you can link to on our website. And now, when Kabul fell, and we are having all of these refugees flee Afghanistan, the churches are lining up to house and welcome refugees. Because your leadership taught them how. And of course, you just furnished a beautiful apartment with a refrigerator full of food from the Middle Eastern market. Another image in my mind, which I hope I never forget, is a photograph taken by Eric Woodworth. Now this scene, this image comes from a Catholic charity in the hallway of this house in the Brooklyn or the Bronx. And it is of Arturo holding his son, Henry. I don't remember how old Henry is at that point. Does anybody remember how old Henry was? 7? 6 or 7? When he was taken from his father at the U.S.-Mexico border. We remember those images of children being separated from their moms and dads, and that was Arturo and Henry. Once you start welcoming people, once you begin those acts of compassion, you cannot stop. And the Woodworth family could do nothing but welcome, with the church's support, this father and son who still live with them. As you know, because you've taken meals and given rides to soccer and celebrated Christmas and given birthday parties. I never want to forget that image of Arturo holding on to Henry after being separated for 4 months. So today we stuff backpacks. Hands-on mission, it's just addictive. Because we experience the presence of Christ, which is love itself. This is just the tip of the iceberg. I could preach for the rest of the day on the work of this congregation. There's English as a second language, prayer shawls, letters to pen pals in prison. The young people go on mission trips. We've helped families who are experiencing homelessness at the Brooks. You clean up Rock Creek Park. You volunteered at Miriam's Kitchen and a Wider Circle and Capital Partners in Education. You give so much of your time and energy, so many of you outside the church. It is just in our DNA to welcome the sojourner, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and help those in prison. And one of the things that we often struggle with is, well, can't all this be done by NGOs? Why shouldn't we support them? Give them our money. Do we really need the church? Of course, the world doesn't have to have the church for people to do good work. There will always be good people who are meeting Christ out there and doing good works. But we have this story. We have this story that when Jesus was killed and hope for a nonviolent world, a world of justice and compassion, died and was all buried in the tomb, God said no and raised Jesus to life. And one of the ways in which Jesus was raised to life is in the church. We are the living body of Jesus Christ. We live that truth of life out of death, and by the power of the Holy Spirit, we practice our faith together, side by side, walking with Jesus. Walking with the essence of the meaning of life and love. And when we cannot continue, when we cannot believe in goodness or the possibility of change, others sitting beside us in the pew will believe for us. And they will say, it's time for you to rest a while. Stop carrying the furniture to the next apartment. It's okay. We'll take it for a while. Tell me what's going on in your life. And eventually they'll say, hey, come on. Let's go to Amazon and see what we can pick out to put in a backpack. I do not believe that acts of compassion save us from eternal damnation. I don't believe that God sends anybody to eternal damnation. But when followers of Jesus live out their Christian calling, when we do that, there is certainly a little less hell on earth. And there's certainly more compassion and more hope, more holiness, more love and more life, more heaven on earth. And we are blessed, and our souls are healed by the love and compassion that flows through us and around us. So thanks be to God for the church. Thanks be to God for all we get to do in the Chevy Chase Presbyterian Church. Thanks be to God, for we are blessed. Amen.